What you're seeing right now isn't reality. It's a prediction. A guess your brain has been generating and feeding you every single second of your life. And you've never once questioned it, because you were never taught it was a guess in the first place. Ancient mystics called this the veil. Neuroscience calls it predictive processing, and the force capable of breaking through it. Seeing past the filter to what's actually there. They called her Sophia. This isn't mysticism. This is happening inside your skull right now, in this exact moment. And once you understand how it works, you will never experience your own mind the same way again. If this just cracked something open for you, hit like. It helps this reach more people whose minds are ready to see this. Subscribe for more explorations at the edge of consciousness and psychology. And drop one word in the comments describing what this brought up for you. I want to see it. Right now, as you watch this, your brain is doing something it has done every single second of your entire life without ever asking your permission. And once you understand what it actually is, you will never experience a single moment the same way again. Your brain is not showing you reality. It is showing you a prediction of reality, a fast, efficient, mostly accurate guess constructed from memory, pattern, and expectation, and then presenting that guess to you as if it were the raw, unfiltered truth of what's actually in front of you. This isn't a philosophical claim or a spiritual metaphor. This is one of the most well-supported findings in modern neuroscience, known formally as predictive processing. And once we walk through what it actually means, you'll understand why ancient mystics, thousands of years before neuroscience existed, were already describing this exact mechanism using an entirely different vocabulary. One built around a figure they called Sophia and a barrier they called the veil. This video is going to walk you through both languages, the ancient and the modern, side by side, because when you see how precisely they line up, something shifts in how you understand your own mind. And that shift, once it happens, tends not to reverse. Let's start with the neuroscience, because it's the foundation everything else in this video builds on. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of perception assumed your brain worked something like a camera, passively receiving raw sensory data from your eyes, ears, and skin, and then processing that data upward into conscious experience. It felt intuitive, it felt obvious, and it turns out to be almost entirely wrong. The modern model, supported by decades of research across cognitive neuroscience, describes something closer to the opposite process. Your brain doesn't wait for sensory data to build a picture from scratch. Instead, it constantly generates predictions about what it expects to encounter based on prior experience, memory, and learned pattern, and then it uses incoming sensory data primarily to check and adjust those predictions, rather than to construct perception from nothing. In other words, your conscious experience of reality in any given moment is mostly your brain's best guess, continuously updated, but a guess nonetheless, and only the portions of experience that significantly violate that guess get flagged for closer conscious attention. This is why you can walk through a familiar room in near darkness without bumping into furniture, because your brain isn't really seeing the room fresh in that moment. It's running a highly confident prediction based on everything it already knows about that space, and only correcting course if something unexpected, like a chair moved 3 feet from where it usually sits, actually shows up in the sensory data. This mechanism is remarkably efficient, and for most practical purposes across evolutionary history, it worked extraordinarily well. The problem, the one this entire video is actually about, is that this same predictive machinery doesn't just apply to physical rooms and furniture. It applies to everything, including your emotions, your relationships, your sense of your own worth, your beliefs about what you're capable of, and your assumptions about how other people see you. And this is where the ancient concept of the veil becomes not just relevant. In Gnostic philosophy, one of the central ideas running through countless texts and traditions is the notion of a veil, a kind of perceptual and cognitive barrier that separates ordinary human consciousness from a deeper, more direct experience of reality. This veil wasn't described as something imposed by an external villain trying to deceive humanity, at least not in the way popular culture sometimes flattens the idea. In the more nuanced Gnostic framework, the veil is described as a kind of forgetting, a layer of accumulated conditioning, assumption, and inherited pattern that gradually builds up over the course of a person's life until it becomes so familiar, so automatic, that a person mistakes the veil itself for reality, entirely unaware that any filtering is happening at all. This is precisely, almost eerily, what predictive processing describes in modern neuroscience. The predictions your brain generates aren't neutral or objective. They're built from your specific history, your childhood experiences, your culture, your relationships, your past failures and successes, and once those predictive patterns become deeply established, usually very early in life, they operate largely outside of conscious awareness, quietly shaping what you notice, what you overlook, how you interpret ambiguous situations, and even how you feel about yourself in moments that have nothing objectively to do with your actual worth or capability. The Gnostic veil and the neuroscience of predictive processing are describing the exact same phenomenon from two completely different historical and cultural starting points. One using the language of myth and cosmology, the other using the language of computational neuroscience. And the fact that these two traditions, separated by thousands of years and radically different methods of inquiry, arrive at such a similar description of the human condition is not a coincidence worth dismissing. It's worth taking seriously. This is where Sophia enters the picture, and understanding her role here requires setting aside any assumption that she's simply a mystical character in an old religious story. In Gnostic tradition, Sophia represents the principle of wisdom, capable of piercing through the veil, not through force, not through external intervention, but through a very specific kind of inward attention. A willingness to look directly at the patterns generating your experience, rather than remaining unconsciously identified with them. This distinction matters enormously because it reframes what awareness actually is. Most people assume awareness simply means paying more attention to what's happening around them, noticing more details in their environment. But the deeper meaning embedded in both the Gnostic tradition and modern cognitive science points somewhere more precise. Awareness of the predictive patterns themselves. The ability to notice not just what you're experiencing, but the underlying assumption generating that experience in the first place. This is an entirely different skill than ordinary attention, and it's genuinely difficult, because by definition, these predictive patterns were built specifically to operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, running efficiently in the background precisely so your conscious mind doesn't have to consciously process every single sensory detail from scratch in every moment. Sophia, symbolically, represents the capacity to make the invisible visible, to bring these background predictions into the light of conscious inspection. And this is precisely the mechanism modern therapeutic and contemplative practices are independently rediscovering through completely different vocabulary. Terms like metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, or cognitive diffusion, the ability to observe a thought or belief without being completely fused with it, as if it were simply an accurate, unquestionable fact. Here's where this becomes deeply personal rather than abstract. Because these predictive patterns aren't randomly generated. They're built layer by layer, primarily during childhood, when your brain was doing exactly what brains are designed to do, rapidly learning the rules of the environment you were placed into, so that you could navigate it efficiently and, crucially, so that you could remain safe within it. If you grew up in an environment where your needs were met inconsistently, your brain likely built a predictive pattern around vigilance and anticipation of disappointment, not because you consciously decided to see the world that way, but because that pattern, at the time it was formed, was actually protective, helping you anticipate and prepare for inconsistency rather than being repeatedly blindsided by it. If you grew up in an environment where your worth felt conditional on performance or achievement, your brain likely built a predictive pattern, linking your sense of safety and belonging directly to external validation. Again, not as a conscious choice, but as an adaptive response to the actual environment you were navigating at the time. The problem is not that these patterns were built. The problem is that they were built for an environment that in most cases no longer exists. And yet the predictive machinery keeps running the same old model, filtering your present-day adult experience through assumptions formed by a much younger, much less resourced version of you. Someone who genuinely needed those patterns to survive a specific set of circumstances that may have ended decades ago. This is the actual mechanism behind so much of what people describe as being stuck, repeating the same relationship dynamics despite consciously wanting something different, feeling inexplicably anxious in situations that appear objectively safe, sabotaging opportunities that align with stated goals, not because of any lack of intelligence or willpower, but because the predictive architecture running beneath conscious awareness was never updated to reflect who you've actually become and what your actual present circumstances actually are. This is also precisely why genuine awareness, the kind Sophia symbolically represents, tends to feel deeply uncomfortable before it feels liberating. And this discomfort deserves to be named honestly, rather than glossed over with vague spiritual positivity. When you begin to notice a predictive pattern that has been quietly running your behavior for years, perhaps decades, there is frequently an initial wave of genuine distress, because the pattern, however limiting, had also been providing a strange kind of stability, a familiar, predictable lens through which to interpret an unpredictable world. Bringing that pattern into conscious awareness temporarily removes the automatic buffer it had been providing. And this is exactly why so many people, even when they intellectually want change, unconsciously resist the very awareness that would make change possible. Ancient Gnostic texts actually anticipated this resistance directly, describing the veil not merely as an obstacle imposed from outside, but as something the mind itself often clings to, precisely because full unfiltered awareness of one's own conditioning can feel destabilizing before it feels freeing. This is not a flaw in you. This is a completely predictable, well-documented feature of how deeply ingrained predictive patterns respond to being consciously examined for the first time. And understanding this in advance is exactly what allows a person to move through that initial discomfort with far more patience and self-compassion than they would otherwise extend themselves, rather than mistaking the discomfort itself as evidence that something has gone wrong. In the chapter ahead, we're going to move directly into the practical architecture of how this awareness actually gets built. 3 specific techniques drawn from the intersection of contemplative tradition and modern cognitive science techniques you can genuinely begin applying today. Not as abstract spiritual concepts, but as concrete practices for beginning to notice and eventually reshape the predictive patterns that have been quietly running your life since long before you had any say in the matter. Let's move directly into the practical architecture now, because understanding the mechanism intellectually only takes you so far. And the actual value of everything we discussed in the first half of this video depends entirely on whether you can translate it into something you actually practice. The first technique, and arguably the most foundational, is what cognitive scientists call the noticing gap, and contemplative traditions have described in almost identical terms for thousands of years under different names. The core practice is deceptively simple, creating a small, deliberate pause between a stimulus and your automatic reaction to it, long enough to ask a single internal question: what prediction is currently running? This sounds abstract until you apply it to something concrete. So, let's walk through an example. Imagine you send a message to someone important to you, and hours pass without a response. For most people, a predictive pattern activates almost instantly and completely outside conscious awareness, generating anxious interpretations. They're upset with you. You said something wrong. They're losing interest. And this predictive interpretation feels, in the moment, completely indistinguishable from objective fact. The noticing gap technique interrupts this fusion by inserting a single question in the space between the trigger and the emotional spiral. Not, why haven't they responded? But, what prediction is my mind currently generating? And is this prediction actually based on current evidence? Or is it based on an old pattern being projected onto a new situation? This question alone doesn't eliminate the anxious feeling immediately, but it does something crucial. It creates separation between you and the pattern, allowing you to observe the prediction rather than being completely absorbed inside it. And this separation is precisely what both ancient contemplative traditions and modern cognitive therapy identify as the essential first step toward any lasting change. You cannot consciously choose to update a pattern you're still completely fused with. Awareness has to come first, and the noticing gap is simply a structured, repeatable way of practicing that awareness in real, everyday moments, rather than only in quiet meditation sessions, disconnected from your actual life. The second technique builds directly on the first and addresses something crucial about where these predictive patterns actually originated. Because awareness alone, while necessary, is often not sufficient to create lasting change if the underlying pattern was formed in response to a genuinely difficult or painful earlier experience. This second technique involves what we might call pattern origin tracing. Gently asking, once you've noticed a recurring predictive pattern, when in your life this particular interpretation first made sense as a protective response. This is not about blaming your past or spending endless time re-litigating old wounds. It's about something much more targeted and practical, recognizing that the anxious interpretation you just noticed in the noticing gap wasn't randomly generated. It was learned, often quite reasonably, in response to a real environment you once had to navigate. Someone who learned early that unpredictable silence often preceded real conflict or abandonment developed a nervous system genuinely calibrated to treat silence as danger. And that calibration made complete sense, given the environment it was formed in. The practice here is to consciously hold both truths simultaneously. That the pattern made sense then, and that it may no longer accurately reflect your current relationships and circumstances. Now, this dual recognition is precisely what allows a predictive pattern to begin updating, rather than remaining permanently frozen in its original protective form. Gnostic tradition describes something remarkably similar through the concept of gnosis itself, direct experiential, knowing rather than abstract intellectual belief. The idea that true transformation doesn't come from simply being told a pattern is inaccurate, but from directly, experientially recognizing its origin and its outdated nature for yourself, in your own felt experience, rather than as someone else's second-hand explanation. The third technique moves from insight into actual behavioral practice, because patterns don't ultimately change through insight alone. They change through repeated, lived experience that provides your predictive machinery with new evidence to incorporate. This technique involves what could be called deliberate counter-evidence generation, consciously and repeatedly placing yourself in small, manageable situations that directly contradict the old predictive pattern. Not through dramatic, overwhelming exposure, but through consistent, graduated practice. If your pattern predicts that expressing a genuine need will lead to rejection, the counter-evidence practice might involve deliberately expressing a small, low-stakes need in a safe relationship and consciously registering what actually happens, rather than what your old pattern predicted would happen. Over time, repeated across enough instances, this practice does something predictive processing research directly confirms. It provides your brain's ongoing predictive model with enough updated data that the old pattern genuinely begins to lose its automatic grip, replaced gradually by a new pattern built on actual current evidence, rather than outdated protective assumption. This is slow work, and it's worth being honest about that, because most meaningful pattern change happens incrementally, through dozens or hundreds of small updated data points, not through a single dramatic realization, however powerful that realization might feel in the moment it occurs. What we've walked through across this entire exploration, the veil, Sophia, predictive processing, and these three practical techniques, ultimately converges on a single, quietly powerful recognition that the reality you've been experiencing your entire life has never been the unfiltered truth of what exists. It has always been your brain's best, most efficient guess, built from patterns that mostly served you well at the time they were formed. And that guess can be examined, questioned, and gradually updated the moment you become willing to look directly at it. This is the actual Sophia code, not a mystical formula handed down from some external source.